Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Film Forward's Inclusive Leadership Series. Before we get started, I want to thank and acknowledge Brenda Terry and the Sign Language Company for helping to make this event more inclusive. So what are we doing here? Film Forward launched a couple of years ago, primarily built around this curriculum called Behaviors of Belonging, where we were helping organizations to develop the tools, skills, and accountability around psychological safety. And what we quickly learned from the data we were getting across every industry and from all of our clients is that leaders really felt like they needed an entirely new set of skills to deal with what is ultimately the most diverse from a number of generations side-by-side perspective, from a ways of working perspective, and also from a demographic and geographic perspective. Most diverse workforce we've ever encountered in history, and it's requiring a really new set of tools and skills. And so rather than just waiting for all these companies to come along and buy our inclusive leadership series, we wanted to go ahead and get ahead of it and help learn from some of our best leaders on how to just start building these skills right out the gate. And so I want to bring on today the most incredible advisor we have. His name is Egan Brinkman. He's the director of commerce at Google, and I've been very, very fortunate to be in relationship with Egan as an advisee for quite some time, and he's got so much practical, actionable advice, but also lives very publicly in his efforts to be an inclusive leader, to care about equity, and he does it inside a very large organization. So Egan, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm touched to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I have to just warn everybody that my dog has decided that now is the moment that he needs all my attention. So if there are odd noises, or if it looks like my shoulder's moving in a funny way, it's because I'm trying to appease a small, ridiculous terrier with some ear scratches. This is what working from home is like.
They're invited to the conversation, I'm sure.
So I just want to start kind of at the beginning, which is, can you talk to us about what your journey to leadership has been like?
My journey to leadership has been probably as windy as your own, as many of us, not quite as linear as I think they tell us it's going to be. Mine started in the Peace Corps, where I got to serve in Ghana, West Africa for a number of years right out of undergrad, doing work in health, water, and sanitation. And it was a really powerful moment and a couple of years for me, because one, as somebody who grew up in the US, as somebody who identifies as white, cisgendered, heterosexual, I was part of this dominant community, and I was moved outside of what I knew, and I was alone. I wasn't surrounded by any other Americans. I was truly immersed in this community. And so it really enabled me to experience what it's like to be outside of what I know, to be an other. There were a lot of positives in being an other, but still I was other. And then I also failed a ton. The US government had this playbook that they handed us to go help the community. And yeah. And you know how that goes when you don't listen, you don't ask what, you just come in, you're like, here's what we're gonna do. So there's nothing like failure on a whole lot of fronts. But it was powerful. And it was those experiences that I think have been transformational in the way that I live, I work, and I try to exist.
That's incredible. So you started by talking about failure. So let's talk about, well, can you give us a little bit more detail on the journey from Peace Corps to senior leadership in Google?
Yeah, so I continued my journey of failure. I came back to the US after recognizing I didn't want to be in nonprofit, not because there's anything wrong with it, but specifically international development had some challenges that I felt were unintentionally diminishing innovation and entrepreneurism just because of it created dependence sometimes depending on the project. So I came back, I wanted to get into sales and marketing. It was the Great Recession of the last one. Nobody was hiring, especially when you didn't have experience. And I applied to and was not accepted to a number of business schools. So the failure continued. But I did what most of us try to do. I started knocking on doors in one of the industries that was hiring, which was the wine industry. Eventually, somebody gave me a shot part-time, hourly. And it was from there that I started to learn marketing and sales, and eventually got an entry-level job at Google. After a couple of years of doing that, just again, same thing, just knocking on doors, trying to position myself. But once I got in, I was able to use a lot of the experiences I gained through that failure, through that time abroad. And what I learned and what I've used as sort of the core is I've always invested in the success of others. And luckily, as a salesperson, I was invested in the success of my customers first. How do you personally succeed? How do you thrive? What can I do? Not about Google or the things that I have, but you to make you succeed and thrive. And then I learned to extend that to my peers and the leaders and the other people around me. And it was what authentically can I bring in my experience, my skill set, my resources, my privilege to make you successful. And by trying to live that way initially just as an individual seller and then eventually as a leader, I think that commitment to others' success has been a key catalyst in my ability to grow over time.
I love this. Can you, is a commitment to other people's success something you can turn into a way of working inside an organization? Or do you think it is like an individual skill or individual impulse?
It's something you can turn into it, but it's the actions and the belief of the individual that bring it to life. So I'll give you an example, right? So in our sales organization, we talk about customer-centric selling, right? How do you create solutions that are in service of the customer and their goals and their needs, right? So arguably, that is a framework and an approach that would be singularly in service of the customer. Yeah. But we give you all of these tools and talk tracks and strategies, and that's great. But at the end of the day, it's really about the listening, asking and being curious, asking really thoughtful questions, and then understanding through that process that creates the opportunity to support others. And it's just a very different paradigm. I think in corporate cultures, we're often like, here are the solutions, just go dole them out based on what you learn. And it's not quite that simple. So I think you can structure it, but I think it's on the individual to really take the process of asking, listening, and being super curious.
I'm drawing a connection now between the American Peace Corps playbook and the standard corporate way of working.
Like, yeah, government's a
system. It's so odd. So one of the reasons I was really excited for this conversation is that you work inside a ginormous and massively influential organization. And I remember you were talking about implementing some new performance review process at Google, and like you started to describe what that actually took. And it's like when you try to think about the universe and your brain goes womp, that's what happened to me. I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities of trying to create a more equitable environment inside a very large organization.
Yeah, it comes with some of its, I think, unique challenges. So one, when you are in an organization of any size, it's going to reflect the structural societal challenges of the place that it comes from, of the society that it sits in. And I think that's something that we don't often acknowledge. Honestly, like Google is an exceptional place. I've thrived, I've loved it. But when you get to a company or an organization of over 150,000, you are now a reflection as much of the community that you come from. And with that comes a lot of those challenges. Yeah. And so in some ways, you're trying to break down some deep structural realities, any ism, racism, sexism, any of it all exists. Though there is the intent and the will not to be there, these are societal challenges and they are reflected in these large organizations. So I think the acknowledgement of that is important because these are big tasks to break this down. It's rare once you get to a certain scale that this just goes away. So the way that I've really focused on this as a leader is focus on the areas where we do have the most control, right? And those are often in our direct teams, who we hire, how we advocate and provide advocacy and support. How do we create cultures and teams? And then my hope is that I can export exceptional leaders who are reflective of the communities that we're serving, who can then be that coaching tree. They become peers, they move on. I make my leaders look effective because ultimately building an inclusive organization results in outstanding business outcomes as well as incredible human outcomes, right? So that's when they come together. And in any public corporation, exceptional business outcomes is why you're hired.
Right.
Exceptional people outcomes is great. If you can do them together,
even better, right? Yeah. So something that you're talking around and towards is this concept of cultural intelligence, right? Like, how do we get the information we need to be relevant to the communities that we're in? It's so interesting, actually, that we tapped you to talk about cultural intelligence, and you started by talking about what happens as like an American abroad, which is usually the least culturally intelligent unit of human that exists. And like what we learned
was that I am, and I was that. Yeah,
I was that also. Yeah, I went abroad right after college, and yes, it is. I wish everybody could do it because or I wish certainly every person who's benefited from colonialism. I wish that
you're part of a dominant group. It's
I wish you get that opportunity to be the only one. I think that's very important. I'm curious about how you think about building that cultural intelligence. So we're getting sort of towards like you have this mentality of serving others, but like as we want to turn it into a skill set for cultural intelligence, how do you think about developing that as a leader?
So I think of it as a competency, right? There's so many leadership competencies that are critical for your success as a leader in any organization. Strategic mindedness, you pick one, right? Like every company's got its list of 5 in terms of your leadership competencies that are critical for your success. And I think this is one. It's one that you can build. Everybody can build it, just like any leadership competency. Some people are going to have a more natural proclivity towards it because of who they are in terms of how they showed up on the planet, their experiences. But regardless, like any other leadership competency, you can invest in it. So that's something I've done with intention throughout my career is invest in my cultural intelligence and how I can bring that. And that's through relationships. That's through personal research, right? Literally reading books, caring about others and their experience. I don't think there's one way to do it, but I think it's a competency you have to personally value and invest in to see progress over time. I think if you just sort of wait for it to happen organically, it's not going to develop naturally, right? It's just like any skill set.
Can you give me some examples of what you think of as somebody practicing the skill of cultural intelligence?
Practicing it, yes. So I think as a leader within an organization, in what way are you creating systems and structures that enable you to bring inclusion and learning and curiosity directly into how you run your team? And so a lot of people think of inclusive leadership as just like who you are, how do you talk to people, but it's actually about being really intentional, I think, and about creating these systems and structures. So examples can be setting aside time in your leadership meetings that are specifically around building this muscle. It can be, we do simple things, right? So once a month, we will grab an article that is reflective of a community or an issue that is going on, and we'll create a discussion. And it is systematic. We do it at least once a month. At one point, I was doing it bi-weekly. Are you talking about and addressing the realities of our world at this moment in time? There are all ways to do it, but I think it's about just creating this and then also putting it as a value and a priority within your organization. That it doesn't have to be, it can be inclusion, it can be equity, it can be whatever value system, but the more that you talk about it, you reinforce it, and then you model the behavior, you can see it happen across the organization. And then the value then is that your team members will bring it back to you, right? You become more effective because you've given the space folks are feeling seen. They will share what is going on in their lives, what their personal experiences are. So it quickly becomes this sort of self-fulfilling process, but you have to be intentional about setting the groundwork for it.
I am really curious. So I'm really curious about the how people hear a concept like cultural intelligence, because, right, so to me it means an ability to communicate, collaborate effectively across a lot of different styles, cultural assumptions, cultural backgrounds, communication styles, maybe even neurodiversity, right? Like that to me is sort of how we think about cultural intelligence. But I always worry that, especially inside very large organizations, people are going to hear the concept of cultural intelligence and think like political swagger. Like, do you know what I mean? Like the ability to manipulate anybody or whatever it is. Like how can we like very clearly distinguish between what is sort of like maneuvering and pleasing everybody and like real cultural intelligent practice?
That's so tough because it's really personal, right?
Oh no,
sorry.
You shut yourself off again.
It was too tough a question. I just had to, I think it's really tough, right? To how to do that at scale. I agree with you that first it's the understanding of like what is the true meaning of it versus what is my assumed meaning. Like I think you could get some folks who also assume it's like a Mensa style thing. It's like, look, like I got it. I got an IQ test and I'm, and it's an award.
I'm a 147 on the cultural intelligence scale.
Right. Versus to your point, I think there are lots of folks who lean into cultural intelligence as for personal gain, right? Because it is maybe strategically valued within an organization. And so showcasing a willingness, and I apologize that my screen went out again. But I think those are examples of where you see that within my organization at times. But I think overall, the way that you do it is you acknowledge and reward outcomes. And I think you have to measure things like inclusion in the same way that you measure business outcomes and reward accordingly. And so this is one of the biggest challenges I've seen with it, is that cultural intelligence isn't on the scoreboard for most public companies in terms of how they report out results. What are the outcomes? How do we hold people accountable? And how do we reward people? And if you were to bring cultural intelligence, any form of it, inclusion, diversity, equity, any piece of that to that same level of importance, measurement, and scoreboard, you would see the behaviors change. And that's the biggest challenge, right? Because I don't know that people tie it to the business outcomes that stockholders over time really value the most, right? Profitability, revenue growth, et cetera.
I have a question I want to ask, but I realize that in a public forum, you may actually have to practice politics to answer it. So I'm going to ask it, and then you can totally say like, no, I can't answer that in a public forum. But would you say that your style of leadership is very much your own? What am I trying to ask? That maybe not all leaders in the organization work with their teams in the same way that you do? Like, are you able to practice this kind of leadership regardless of what's happening around you?
It's a great question. So I'll answer it this way, which is I have the luxury of practicing a style of leadership that is true to me, right? So the way I show up is authentically me. It's how I live. It's how I breathe. As you've seen, it's how I show up publicly, privately. There's not a big difference between those for me. I think every leader is going to be different. What I feel is, candidly, I've been able to use my experience and my privilege to show up that way because I sit in these buckets. So I feel comfortable taking the risk, whether there is or isn't that risk to show up in that way. I don't know that every leader feels empowered to do that in an organization. This isn't Google specific. I think in general, I think large organizations have norms and expectations. And so I feel blessed, lucky, and also I recognize my privilege in being able to do it, but I don't know how you change that, right? Because I think that's a big society challenge, right? I can take those risks and be myself, and not everybody can.
Yeah. Well, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I see you doing it publicly all the time.
Yeah.
I think you are in a position to and do say things that might be potentially dangerous for somebody without your position of privilege. So how do you think about like consciously using your privilege and position to advance equity in your organization?
Yeah. As I reflect on like where my largest area of development has been on this journey, it's been the recognition, acknowledgement of my privilege. I mean, going abroad was great, but it helped me understand difference. It didn't help me understand privilege. And I think it was coming back and seeing the world through other people's realities and having a number of moments where I got my privileges sort of put in my face that I recognized, one, that exists, and two, how powerful it is. So I think it's that recognition that has enabled me to take more risk. And so the way that I do it is I do it on as many fronts as I can. So it's equity, right? So within my teams, I'm very intentional about looking at everything from performance reviews to promotions to who we hire to all of those things. Make sure that there's a lens on equity, that we are identifying bias and that we're offering these outcomes based on what we value and those outcomes. I do it based on advocacy. Again, I want to export as many exceptional leaders as I can. And so being sure that I'm advocating for them both publicly and privately, right, behind the doors that they can't sit in. And then promotion is the same way. So I try to do it from every lens. Obviously, culturally, I value it, but I think systematically, those are ways that you can just be super intentional. And then using my voice, showing that white men too can do this work, and that in fact it's on us because we sit in these positions to have the most influence to make change and to recognize that while the world is the way it is because of history and where we've gotten, there's so much potential for growth and evolution, and we can be a part of that. It's just we have to have the courage, we have to take a little risk, and those aren't necessarily things that those of us who sit in dominant groups are used to. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I muted it because my dog was starting to bark. I love this so much because you won't necessarily get a trophy for it, nor should you expect one, right? I think you said something about the scoreboard, and I actually think that's such an important and apt metaphor, is that we do play business like sports, who's winning, who's losing, who's dominating. And a lot of our sort of promotion-based advancement is in like who's hitting them, exceeding their KPIs, and also like that sports metaphor is so apt. And also, we only care about the things we keep score about, right?
Yeah.
And it's like a very niche segment of stats wonks that actually care about like how many assists really went into that game, right? And so it's really interesting for you to say it that way, and it just has me thinking about that. What you're talking about is reframing some of the work you do to be certainly advancing the competency and the performance of your organization, even in ways you might not get points for.
Yeah.
And I think that's really hard for folks. I think you're talking about creating a personal incentive structure.
Yeah.
That is about how you want to show up in the world and how you want to be remembered and the legacy you want to leave. And it isn't going to be handed to you by the organization. No, you answered my question perfectly, because my question was like, how does this live inside an organization? And you're like, it doesn't. It actually lives with the leader. The leader, that's, I'm not going to swear because I want people to be able to take this into, but like, that's what leadership is.
Yeah, that's it.
Right? It is leading. It's not following. It's not conforming. It's leading. I really, really appreciate that so much. And especially the point around advocating in rooms that people aren't in, right? So advocating even when there's no shine on you, nobody's going to give you credit for it, or even it's a little politically unpopular, right? I think that piece of it is so, so crucial. So like this is sort of an unfair question because it's going to be like, to pick a favorite child. But like, if you were to say, okay, this is kind of the most important tenet or my like key piece of advice for practicing inclusive leadership, what makes the top of your list? You don't have to pick just one. It's okay.
No, I mean, there are a lot. So I think number one is you have to model the behavior you're talking about. I think one of the challenges you see is people talk a great, like that, right? It's like, I care, and I am really glad that you say those things. Like that is step one. And then step two is the modeling. And modeling means things like taking risks, particularly if you're, again, in a position of power and a dominant, it means really doing the hard work. And when you do those two things together, transformation can happen. What you see so often, unfortunately, is one or the other, right? You see somebody who's only talking about it and not modeling the behavior across the organization or within their teams. Or occasionally you have somebody modeling and not talking about it. I think those are the unsung heroes. And so those don't get recognized necessarily, but I think it's those two things together. Okay. And I do think you have to have a conversation with yourself about risk tolerance, right? So particularly for those of us who come from dominant groups, we're not necessarily used to taking risk. There could be real risk financially, socially, politically, that you're taking on by really, again, modeling the behavior and advocating and pushing for change that might not be aligned perfectly with any individual group or organization. And so just being mindful, being okay with that. But again, aligning to your values, the legacy that you want to lead, the reasons you work, right? Like we all work for a paycheck, but most of us work for more than just a paycheck if we have the means to do that, right? Again, that's socioeconomically, some of us just work for a paycheck, but when you're in positions like I am, like there's purpose, right? There's all these things because we're in these unique positions of privilege. And so how do you align those things?
Well, I think we're specifically talking about leadership, and we're talking about leadership at levels of consideration where you may be working for a paycheck, but you have other people you're responsible to who report to you, right? So sort of regardless, you have this layer of responsibility for other people's mental health. I mean, they say that one of the number one indicators of people's mental health at work is their manager. Good Lord, that's a lot of responsibility, And like, I think a lot of leaders get into those roles being like, I didn't sign up for that. And the truth is, like, a lot of us didn't sign up for a lot of these structures, to be perfectly honest. And so how can we really craft the best experience for ourselves and others, given the hand we were dealt? I really, really appreciate this conversation so much, Egan. And just as I suspected, like all of our other guests, you managed to stick the landing with 1 minute left to go. It's remarkable how all of you have figured out how to do that. Modeling the behavior. I mean, that's such a profound demonstration of cultural intelligence, isn't it? Like, people see that you understand it because you are doing it. And the other piece I'm taking away is, like, don't expect a trophy for doing this work. That's not the point.
No. Yep. They don't hand out trophies for it, and you shouldn't be doing it for the trophy. I agree. Do it for the impact. Do it for the values. Do it for the outcomes.
Thank you so much. This has been really wonderful, Egan. I'm so grateful to you, and Brenda and the Sign Language Company, so grateful to you as well. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today and who tunes in the future. And we'll have another inclusive leadership session for you coming up next. You can follow our Film Forward by Seed and Spark page on LinkedIn for more. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.